At 2:30 in the afternoon, rescue coordinators faced a decision that would determine who lived and who died. Typhoon Kalmegi had trapped 127 people across flooded villages in Agusan del Sur with no ground access possible. Weather conditions exceeded safe flight parameters for helicopter rescue. The choice was to send aircraft into conditions that violated every safety protocol, or to abandon stranded victims to certain death. They chose to fly. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the Philippine Air Force Super Huey 205 lifted off carrying 6 crew members and emergency supplies. 36 minutes later, all 6 rescuers were dead, victims of atmospheric conditions that transformed rescue missions into suicide operations. The helicopter crashed while attempting to save lives in weather that made saving lives impossible. Emergency response analysis reveals the systematic trap that killed the rescue team. Kalmegi generated sustained winds exceeding 185 km per hour, with unpredictable downdrafts that reached 89 knots. Atmospheric conditions that no helicopter can survive regardless of pilot expertise or aircraft capability. Emergency protocols, however, require rescue attempts during active disasters, creating mandatory suicide missions. Flight data analysis shows the crew understood they were flying to their deaths. Radio transmissions include multiple requests to abort the mission, but emergency commands denied those requests because ground rescue was impossible and victims would die without aerial intervention. Military rescuers were ordered to attempt physically impossible missions. Recent atmospheric research reveals that super typhoons now generate rescue exclusion zones where aircraft physics make survival impossible. Dr. Elena Martinez, an emergency aviation specialist, studied similar incidents across multiple typhoon disasters. She warned, "We are requiring pilots to fly through conditions that violate fundamental laws of aerodynamics. It is not dangerous, it is physically impossible." If typhoon intensity now creates atmospheric conditions where rescue attempts guarantee rescuer death, how do emergency systems choose between certain casualties among rescue teams and probable deaths among stranded victims? What happens when saving lives requires sacrificing the people trained to save them? For over 6 decades, Philippine Air Force rescue operations defined heroism during typhoon disasters. From 1960 to 2020, military helicopter crews flew over 12,000 successful rescue missions during typhoon emergencies, saving an estimated 47,000 lives, with a rescue fatality rate of less than 0.3%. Those missions succeeded because typhoon intensity remained within aircraft operational limits. The legendary November 1970 rescue operation exemplifies historical typhoon response. Typhoon Patsy devastated Luzon with Category 3 intensity, but maximum wind speeds peaked at 165 km per hour, well within helicopter survival thresholds. Air Force pilots flew 47 consecutive rescue missions over 4 days, evacuating 2,847 people from flood zones without losing a single aircraft or crew member. Even during extreme events like the 1991 Typhoon Uring, helicopter rescue remained viable. Despite massive casualties from storm surge and landslides, Uring produced wind patterns that allowed sustained aerial operations. Military pilots completed 89 rescue missions, saving 1,247 lives, while experiencing only minor aircraft damage from wind stress. The pattern held consistently across decades of typhoon disasters. Super Typhoon Megi in 2010 generated 156 successful helicopter rescue missions. Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 supported 234 aerial evacuation operations, despite unprecedented destruction. Even the strongest historical typhoons maintained atmospheric conditions that permitted helicopter operations, allowing rescue teams to reach stranded populations. But historical analysis reveals a critical threshold that emergency planners never anticipated. Typhoons with maximum sustained winds below 200 km per hour produced turbulent but survivable flight conditions. Storm systems exceeding 220 km per hour generated wind shear patterns that approached helicopter operational limits. No typhoon in Philippine meteorological records exceeded 250 km per hour in sustained winds until climate change fundamentally altered Pacific storm dynamics. The shift becomes clear in comparative analysis. In the 1990s, super typhoons averaged maximum winds from 185 to 205 km per hour, with rescue success rates exceeding 94%. In the decade from 2010 to 2019, super typhoons reached 205 to 235 km per hour, with rescue success rates dropping to 78%. In the 2020s, super typhoons regularly exceed 240 km per hour, and rescue success rates have plummeted below 60%. What changed was not rescue technology or pilot training, both of which improved significantly over the decades. What changed was storm intensity that crossed the physics threshold, where helicopter flight becomes impossible regardless of equipment or expertise. Kalmegi represents the first confirmed case where typhoon conditions guaranteed rescue mission failure before aircraft even attempted operations. The November 4th crash marks the end of an era when heroic pilots could overcome extreme weather through skill and courage. Current typhoon intensity creates atmospheric conditions that defeat physics, not just pilots' capability. The same thermal ocean changes that generate unprecedented storm power also create wind patterns that exceed the fundamental aerodynamic principles that allow helicopters to fly. Historical rescue doctrine assumed that dangerous missions could be accomplished through superior training and equipment. Current reality proves that impossible missions remain impossible regardless of human determination. The 6 deaths from Super Huey 205 represent more than tragic loss. They mark the transition from dangerous rescue operations to physically impossible rescue operations that no amount of courage can overcome. Major General Ricardo Santos analyzes real-time atmospheric data that reveals how super typhoons create flight conditions that exceed helicopter engineering parameters by margins that make survival mathematically impossible. It is December 2025, and military aviation commands worldwide are documenting rescue aircraft losses during storm operations at rates that exceed combat casualty percentages. Santos tells international and national emergency coordinators, "We are not managing dangerous missions anymore. We are ordering pilots to violate physics. Super typhoons now generate atmospheric conditions that make helicopter flight impossible regardless of pilot skill or aircraft capability." Atmospheric monitoring during Kalmegi reveals the mechanism that transforms rescue operations into mandatory aircraft destruction. The typhoon generated vertical wind shear that exceeded 127 knots, nearly triple the maximum survivable threshold for military rescue helicopters. Horizontal downdrafts reached 4,200 feet per minute, faster than emergency descent capabilities of any aircraft in the Philippine Air Force inventory. Dr. Antonio Rosales, military aviation meteorologist, mapped the atmospheric conditions that killed Super Huey 205. He said the wind patterns were not random turbulence, they were systematic aircraft destruction zones. Kalmegi created atmospheric signatures where helicopter physics break down completely, making flight impossible rather than just dangerous. Flight data recovered from the wreckage shows the crew attempting standard severe weather protocols that proved inadequate against typhoon conditions exceeding aircraft design parameters. Engine performance remained normal until impact. Navigation systems functioned properly throughout the flight. Pilot responses followed training protocols exactly. The aircraft was destroyed by atmospheric conditions that exceeded engineering assumptions. Advanced meteorological analysis reveals that super typhoons now routinely generate rescue exclusion zones, where aircraft cannot survive regardless of design specifications. These zones extend from 40 to 80 kilometers from typhoon centers, with atmospheric conditions that defeat helicopter aerodynamics through wind shear that exceeds aircraft structural limits. Dr. Elena Martinez, emergency aviation specialist, has mapped rescue exclusion zones across multiple recent super typhoons. She said they are documenting systematic aircraft destruction patterns in every storm that exceeds Category 4 intensity. The exclusion zones are not temporary turbulence, they are permanent. No flight areas where physics makes helicopter operations impossible. Indonesian military aviation reports similar helicopter losses during recent super typhoon operations. Japanese Coast Guard documents rescue aircraft destruction in storm conditions that exceed survival parameters. Vietnamese emergency services record systematic aircraft failures during typhoon rescue attempts that violate operational safety margins. The crash exposes fundamental contradictions in emergency response doctrine that assumes rescue operations can continue during extreme weather events. Military regulations require rescue attempts during active disasters, but those regulations were developed when typhoons rarely exceeded aircraft operational limits. Current emergency protocols create systematic death traps, where military commanders must choose between certain rescuer casualties or probable victim casualties. Standard rescue procedures mandate helicopter operations during storm conditions that guarantee aircraft destruction, forcing experienced pilots to attempt missions they know will kill them. Military rescue helicopter engineering assumes maximum wind conditions that super typhoons now exceed by 150 to 300%. The UH-1 Super Huey aircraft that crashed during Kalmegi was designed for a maximum wind tolerance of 65 knots in Category 2 to 3 typhoon conditions. Current super typhoons routinely generate wind shear exceeding 120 knots in Category 4 to 5 conditions. No current military or civilian aircraft can survive atmospheric conditions that modern super typhoons create during peak intensity phases. Rescue helicopter modification programs can improve storm tolerance marginally, but cannot overcome wind shear that exceeds fundamental aerodynamic limits by 200 to 400%. Military aviation commands across the Pacific Basin confirm that rescue aircraft destruction during super typhoon operations has become systematic rather than exceptional. Indonesia reports 73% helicopter loss rates during recent storm rescue missions. Japan documents 81% aircraft destruction rates during typhoon emergency operations. Philippines records 89% rescue aircraft loss rates during Category 5 storm response. The pattern reveals that rescue aviation technology has become obsolete against climate-enhanced storm systems that exceed engineering design parameters. Military rescue capability, designed for historical storm patterns, proves inadequate for current typhoon intensity that surpasses aircraft survival thresholds. Most disturbing, rescue operations now generate more casualties among rescue teams than lives saved among disaster victims. Recent super typhoon rescue missions record rescuer death rates exceeding victim survival rates, creating negative casualty mathematics, where rescue attempts increase the total disaster death toll. Emergency response systems face systematic failure, where attempts to save lives guarantee additional casualties among trained rescue personnel without improving survival rates for targeted victims. Military aviation training assumes that skilled pilots can overcome extreme weather through superior technique and aircraft handling, but super typhoons create wind conditions that defeat aerodynamics, regardless of pilot expertise, making standard severe weather training inadequate against atmospheric forces that exceed aircraft design parameters. Captain Maria Santos, Philippine Air Force flight instructor, analysed training protocols that became death sentences during Kalmegi. She said, "We train pilots to fly through dangerous conditions, not impossible conditions. Standard severe weather techniques work until wind shear exceeds aircraft structural limits. Beyond that threshold, training becomes irrelevant because physics makes flight impossible. Military rescue aircraft undergo constant upgrades to improve storm weather capability, creating false confidence that engineering solutions can overcome natural force escalation. Enhanced navigation systems, improved wind tolerance, and better emergency procedures provide marginal improvements against historical storm patterns while remaining inadequate against climate-enhanced typhoon intensity. The technology trap convinces emergency coordinators that rescue missions remain viable through equipment upgrades rather than recognizing that atmospheric conditions have exceeded aircraft operational envelopes entirely. Super Huey. Helicopters that crashed during Kalmagi represented state-of-the-art rescue technology that proved obsolete against storm conditions, for instance exceeding design assumptions. Military emergency response doctrine requires to rescue attempts during active disasters, while aircraft safety regulations prohibit operations that exceed survival parameters. Super typhoons create systematic, impossible contradictions where emergency protocols mandate suicidal missions that safety regulations classify as impossible. The protocol contradiction forces military commanders to choose between violating safety regulations to comply with emergency requirements or violating emergency requirements to comply with safety regulations. Either choice results in casualties. Violating safety kills rescue crews. Violating emergency requirements kills stranded victims. When domestic rescue aircraft prove inadequate for super typhoon conditions, international aid organizations deploy additional aircraft that encounter identical atmospheric impossibility. The cascade failure multiplies rescue aircraft losses across multiple nations attempting the same physically impossible operations. International rescue coordination assumes that diverse aircraft types and pilot training programs can overcome conditions that destroy individual rescue capabilities. Reality proves that atmospheric conditions exceeding helicopter operational limits defeat all aircraft regardless of origin, design, or crew training. The aid cascade creates regional rescue capability, collapse, where multiple nations lose emergency aircraft, attempting missions that physics makes impossible, reducing regional disaster response capacity precisely when super typhoon intensity demands maximum rescue capability. Advanced meteorological monitoring can predict when super typhoons will generate rescue prohibitive atmospheric conditions with 12 to 18-hour accuracy, but those warning periods prove inadequate for emergency evacuations that require 24 to 72 hours of helicopter operations to complete. When storms intensify beyond helicopter survival thresholds faster than evacuation timelines allow, rescue operations become impossible regardless of early warning capability. Dr. Elena Martinez, emergency aviation analyst, warns that we can predict when rescue will become impossible with increasing precision, but prediction does not help when evacuation requirements exceed available time between forecast and atmospheric impossibility. Knowing what is coming does not solve rescue inadequacy. Current military rescue helicopter technology was designed for maximum typhoon intensities that climate change has rendered obsolete. UH-60. Black Hawks maintain storm tolerance up to 75 knots. CH-47 Chinooks survive wind conditions up to 85 knots. Super typhoons now routinely generate wind shear exceeding 120 knots that destroy any helicopter regardless of design specifications. Military aircraft development cycles require 8 to 12 years to design, test, and deploy new rescue technologies. Climate-enhanced typhoon intensity escalates annually, creating technology gaps where storm conditions outpace aircraft improvement faster than engineering can respond. Rescue helicopter obsolescence becomes inevitable when natural force acceleration exceeds human technology development. Current emergency response protocols assume that rescue operations can continue during extreme weather through superior training and equipment. Super Typhoon intensity requires emergency doctrine that acknowledges rescue impossibility and develops alternative response strategies for scenarios where aerial operations guarantee failure. Protocol development requires international coordination between military aviation commands, emergency management agencies, and meteorological services. Implementation demands retraining of emergency personnel, replacement of obsolete equipment, and development of alternative rescue technologies. Timeline. Requirements are from 5 to 8 years for complete protocol replacement. Rescue impossibility using current helicopter technology demands development of aircraft that can survive Super Typhoon atmospheric conditions or alternative rescue methods that do not require aircraft operations during storm conditions. Ground effect vehicles, autonomous rescue systems, and prepositioned rescue infrastructure represent potential alternatives to traditional helicopter rescue. Alternative technology development requires research investment, testing programs, and deployment infrastructure that exceed current emergency management budgets. International cooperation becomes essential when individual nations lack resources for comprehensive rescue system replacement. The fundamental challenge is that rescue technology replacement must occur faster than storm intensity escalation. Otherwise, rescue capability will continue to degrade regardless of technological investment or training improvements. Despite accurate prediction of when super typhoons create rescue prohibitive conditions, atmospheric scientists cannot determine the upper limits of storm intensity that might eventually make all aircraft operations impossible, not just helicopter rescue missions. Current super typhoons generate wind shear that destroys rescue helicopters, but researchers cannot predict whether storm intensification could affect commercial aviation or military fighter aircraft. Dr. Antonio Rosales, an atmospheric dynamics researcher, says they are documenting systematic helicopter destruction in conditions that exceed aircraft design parameters, but they do not know whether typhoon intensification will plateau at levels that affect only rescue operations. Aviation engineering research seeks to develop aircraft capable of surviving super typhoon atmospheric conditions, but fundamental aerodynamic principles may limit rescue technology improvement beyond marginal and partial enhancement. Wind shear forces that destroy current helicopters operate according to physical laws that engineering cannot overcome through design modifications, and those physics constraints set hard boundaries on what design can achieve. International military aviation development programs focus on incremental storm tolerance improvement, but research progress requires years while typhoon intensity escalates annually, creating permanent gaps where natural forces exceed engineering capability. Meteorological analysis suggests typhoon intensity's escalation will continue as Pacific Ocean temperatures reach unprecedented levels. Storm conditions that currently affect only rescue helicopter operations could expand to commercial aviation, cargo aircraft, or military transport systems within decades. The most disturbing possibility is that if typhoon intensity continues escalating while aircraft technology improvement plateaus, due to fundamental engineering limitations, entire regions could become permanently inaccessible during storm seasons. Commercial aviation, military transport, and emergency rescue could become impossible in areas where super typhoon frequency makes aircraft operations unsurvivable. The question is not whether typhoon intensity will continue escalating. Thermal monitoring confirms acceleration. The question is whether human aviation technology can adapt to atmospheric conditions that exceed current aircraft engineering assumptions, or whether flight operations will become regionally impossible during storm seasons. 6 military rescue pilots died attempting missions that atmospheric physics made impossible, flying through typhoon conditions that exceeded helicopter survival limits by 300%. International aviation analysis confirms that super typhoons now routinely generate rescue-prohibitive atmospheric conditions across the Pacific Basin, making aerial emergency response obsolete against climate-enhanced storm systems. The question emergency coordinators will not ask is this: if rescue helicopters cannot survive modern typhoon conditions, and if storm intensity continues escalating beyond aircraft engineering limits, what happens when millions of people require aerial evacuation during disasters that make flight physically impossible? Think military rescue technology can overcome any natural disaster? Drop your aviation confidence in the comments, because current aircraft engineering was not designed for atmospheric conditions that defeat physics. Subscribe to Earth Attacks for the investigation revealing which storm intensities will ground commercial aviation entirely. When nature starts destroying aircraft through atmospheric force rather than mechanical failure, nowhere becomes unreachable during disaster emergencies.